Joining me now is California Democratic Congressman Harley Rouda, one of the new Democrats that won in Orange County and turned Orange County from red to blue. Congressman Rouda, good to see you, sir.
Thanks, Chuck.
Let me start with, do you find this to be a lost week since the party in the majority, you guys had to spend most of your time fighting with each other?
Well, fortunately, we got a lot of other things accomplished, including H.R. 1 today. But yes, it's a distraction. It's a distraction none of us need.
How do you articulate what happened here? Do you take Congresswoman Omar at her word that she wasn't trying to be anti-Semitic? And do you still think she owes an apology? She's never apologized for the remarks she made about the Benjamins.
Well, I think it would behoove all of us in elected positions, from the president to the members of Congress, to do a better job of choosing our words correctly, acting like the diplomats that we are elected to be, and making sure that we are not denigrating anybody, any minority, the press, or much of what we've seen really starts at the top. We want to see a president that is a leader in how we should behave, and hopefully the rest of us can follow suit.
I know that Democrats want to say, hey, this is great, it's big tent, look at that majority, and you're going to have people from all walks of life, and that's something you're trying to celebrate. At what point can you not unify? Is there a point where your tent's too big?
Both tents are big, whether it's the Republican tent or the Democratic tent. You've got on the Republican side Steve King saying outlandish remarks, and I don't think Steve King represents the majority of Republicans. I certainly hope that's not the case, and nor would I ever suggest that's the case. So all of us, again, whether it's on the far right or the far left, that sometimes make antagonistic remarks, it is not going to serve us as lawmakers in Congress getting our job done.
Should that resolution be as watered down as it was? I mean, the only thing missing was people that hate puppies.
Actually, I don't think it was watered down. I think it's exactly what we wanted to see, that denigrating any minority, denigrating any individuals, denigrating the whole list we had in there is exactly what we should be fighting back. Hate is hate, whether it's anti-Semitism or otherwise.
So you're comfortable that it didn't directly address the issue?
Well, I think it did address the issue. It addressed the larger issue of hate in general, which is exactly what we as lawmakers need to stand up and fight back. And I'll give you an example. Even this week in Newport Beach, in my district, we had a situation with some kids who were celebrating Nazism and doing the Heil Hitler sign. And that behavior is not appropriate. It's not funny, and it's not appropriate at any time.
Michael Cohen testified before your committee, and now his testimony is being called into question. His lawyer's having to correct a piece of it. Michael Cohen, do you believe anything he said to you?
I will believe anything that is corroborated, and that is the purpose of why we had him in there.
You don't take him at his word on anything, then, it sounds like. He's got to bring receipts before you believe anything he says?
Yeah, pretty much true. I take anything he says with a shaker of salt, because we need to make sure and corroborate what he has said to be true. Now, of course, when he brings in cashed checks written by the President of the United States while he's sitting in office as hush money, that's pretty good evidence. And we need to make sure that we continue to dig deep to corroborate that information.
Do you think what's being alleged is enough to pursue a charge that Michael Cohen lied to Congress under oath?
I don't think we've got full evidence there to find out yet. And so, let's continue to dig. To me, the bigger issue that came up today was this discussion that President Trump had a conversation with him about pardoning him. And I'm very concerned about that, because what was that conversation? Was there a quid pro quo that was discussed? And if so, that's clearly obstruction of justice and tampering with a witness.
But how do you know unless you get testimony from the president?
Exactly. Let's keep pushing and see if we can get that testimony and get Mueller's report made public.
Let me ask you this. There was a report that your committee got some leaked information about the security clearance process involving Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. These are papers actually you guys have requested from the White House. They had not yet turned over. Obviously, there's somebody leaking it from the White House. How soon do you guys plan to hold hearings on this based on the leaked evidence that you have?
Well, I'm certainly going to defer to the chairman, Elijah Cummings, as to the timing of that. But we are concerned, and all Americans should be concerned about security clearances being issued to people that national security has said should not receive a clearance.
Do you think we should know? Do you think the American people, look, he's the president's son-in-law, and he can give anybody security clearances that he wants. Do you think the American people should know why the CIA did not want to give him the highest access available?
I do. If the president's going to disregard their advice and demand that the security clearance be given him. Look, I look at this stuff not as a Democrat or Republican. I look at what's right and what's wrong. And I can tell you if the Clintons tried to give Chelsea a security clearance and national security advisors said no, I would be up in arms about that as well. It's just plain wrong.
Before I let you go, you haven't endorsed Kamala Harris. A lot of your colleagues in Congress have. Are you still shopping?
I've taken the position that I'm going to wait until August to do endorsements, whether it's local races, whether it's congressional races or presidential. We've got a lot of great candidates, and Kamala Harris is a dynamite candidate. And we also have other ones. So, let's see how they do the next few months, and then I'll hop in.
All right. Congressman Harley Rouda, Democrat from Southern California, Orange County to be exact. Thank you for coming on again, sharing your views. Much appreciated. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.